That can't have been good, whispered David to himself as he silently moved through the underbrush, exercising caution as to not step on anything foreign. He held his rifle close to his chest, alert and watching for the slightest displacement in the world around him, unknown and untamed. What he thought would be a normal intelligence mission had gone completely wrong, and he was now alone, left to fend for himself against whatever else could be inhabiting this island. And it all happened so fast. Things had gone downhill quicker than he even had time to process. As his thoughts ran furiously, he remembered his 2 sons at home, the reason he even took up this job in the first place.
Damn it all. He couldn't help but blurt out in frustration. Not only were his friends gone, but he wasn't even able to grab the intel that he was sent to extract. He didn't know how he was going to explain this to his boys. He felt ashamed. If he failed at this, then what good was he as a father? He sighed and glanced up at the sky, his eyes shining like amber in the late afternoon sun, his beard and short-cut hair retaining their usual rusty brown color. He'll at least make it back to them, and find some other, less surprising ways of earning money.
The jungle was damp as the sun cast a blanket of orange over the world, a final goodbye before the moon took its place in about an hour. Rays of light broke through the tree line, illuminating leaves and particles of debris floating through the air. The constant drone of insects accompanied by a choir of distant birds was all that could be heard. They refused to let silence take their place. "Where do I even go?" he said to himself, flipping through a bound journal that had the words "theisle" hand-carved into the leather cover. "That bastard has to have a map in here somewhere," he sighed, his eyes brightening up when he finally found what seemed to be the sketch of the island, with specific locations being highlighted, exclamation points written boldly beside them. At the top of the page, the words Isla Velada were scribbled in. "Perfect," he thought, smiling to himself. "If I can make my way to the cliffsides, I'll still have time to meet Thomas." He would still have time to escape this place with his life. However, he would need to find a waypoint and go from there. This jungle was impossible to navigate from the inside. As he pushed forward deeper into the forest, he took note of the sun as it continued its descent. He'd have to settle down somewhere soon, somewhere safe, where he won't be at risk of... His thought process was interrupted by a series of low rumbles. Stomps, actually. And they were getting louder. He clicked the safety of his rifle, turning it off and bracing himself for whatever it was he was about to encounter. He still had no visual. Rather, he heard groaning, huffing. Several meters away from him, the foliage shook, indicating where they were. The barrel of his gun swung to face the moving brush as he sidestepped behind a tree for cover. He felt his blood run cold as he got flashbacks of what had occurred the night before. He would have to face that again, by himself now. No support. He kept his eyes fixated on his would-be target, until a small 4-legged animal leaped from the bushes into view. It was a dinosaur. Its tail was disproportionately long, and its body was a light brown. It pawed at the ground, curiously letting out a series of high-pitched grunts, similar to those of a baby goat. He didn't recognize it, though, and it sure looked a hell of a lot different from the ones he had already had the displeasure of meeting. David then took out another journal. This one had the word species carved into the cover. He frantically flipped through, as the creature still hadn't noticed him. He was met with a page that contained a sketch of what looked similar to the animal now standing only a few meters away from him, notes scribbled besides in an unorganized, chaotic fashion. The page was titled Dinosaur. He ran his finger through the notes. It was a herbivore, and they can be quite aggressive when provoked. In quotations, he read, "Stay away from its claws, tail, and don't stand behind it." "So don't shoot it then. Alright, cool. But it looks a lot smaller than the drawing." A sudden deep groan made him flinch. He lowered his body and looked towards the animal. It wasn't making those sounds before. How could something so small be so loud? And just then, a larger, darker-colored specimen had emerged from the foliage, nudging the smaller one. This one was definitely an adult. David's question had been almost immediately answered as the bull presented itself. Strangely enough, it gave off a stench that reminded him of horses. Manure. The familiar stink of livestock. The animal scanned the small jungle clearing like a sentry, and stood up onto its hind legs, prompting David to widen his eyes in amazement at the claws on its front legs. sharp as knives and thick enough to punch a hole through a metal door. The dinosaur inhaled deeply, letting out a hissing grunt as it sniffed the surrounding area. It didn't make any indication of having caught David's scent. But how could it? He already smelled of earth and decay. You'd be hard-pressed to find any other kind of stench in this godforsaken place. Before the Tenontosaurus had dropped down onto all fours, it let out a honk, almost as if it were broadcasting to others. And shortly after, that rumbling sound from before was back, louder than ever. David held his breath. Was it another dinosaur? A carnivore? Another adult Tenontosaurus emerged from the bush. And then another. And another. A herd of at least a dozen animals trudged through the clearing, the adults almost in single file. The babies were rambunctious and didn't move in any particular order. Instead, they stuck close to their mothers, or with the other baby Tenontos. Beneath them scurried several smaller dinosaurs that resembled birds. They walked on two legs, and had feathers that sported every color conceivable. David had never seen such vibrant patterns on an animal before. Some specimens had large eyebrows that stretched back further than the very length of their bodies. Their calls sounded like avian trills as they weaved in between the legs of the larger dinosaurs. He wondered if they knew how easily they could be crushed by one of those things. Swiftly, he took out his journal once again and flipped through until he found yet another sketch that fit the description. Hypsilophodon. Quite the mouthful. He observed a few of them jumping into the air to catch the horseflies trying to suck the blood of the Tennontosauruses. Some even had the confidence to jump onto their backs to hitch a ride. And the Tenontos seemed completely unbothered. They welcomed this, even. Free pest control. David, for once, found himself completely speechless at the sight. Dinosaurs were once again roaming the earth. This wasn't a dream. And this wasn't some coma his ex-girlfriend had put him in. Before he made it across the clearing, the bull stopped and shifted his attention toward David. He had the sudden urge to want to pee himself. Somehow, his instincts told him not to grab his gun, and instead make himself look smaller, like less of a threat. He had grown up on a farm in rural America, so he had been taught many ways to deal with wild animals, curling up into a ball when confronted with a grizzly, making loud noises and waving your arms to scare off cougars. But this wasn't a bear, or some overgrown cat. This was a once extinct creature, somehow brought back to this time. And yet, it wasn't showing any signs of fear or aggression. No growls, no puffing up, nothing. Instead, the animal stared at the human, curiously tilting its head to one side before letting out a huff of dismissal, continuing on its way. It seemed apathetic to David's presence. As he continued to observe, there was a strange, ancient beauty about them, a gracefulness in their movements, majesty, and power. Dinosaurs had ruled the world uncontested for over 160 million years. It took an asteroid to take them out and end their reign, an act of cosmic coincidence. And even then, some survived in the form of birds. Modern humans only appeared about 300,000 years ago. We were infants compared to them. And David was overwhelmed by the very existence of this island. His oldest son was obsessed with dinosaurs, so he had seen the documentaries and cartoons, heard the speculations, and stood with the fossils in the museums, but none of those compared to the real thing. If only he could take a picture, have proof of this. He smiled to himself, thinking about what his son would say if he saw this. God, he would lose his mind. He'd probably make the dinosaurs think he was one of them with how much he would be yelling with excitement. David slowed down his breathing, calming his nerves for a second. The first instance of relaxation in days. He would have an incredible story to tell if he made it back. No, when he made it back. After the herd of dinosaurs had disappeared through the other side of the meadow, David waited a few minutes to watch for any strays. The last of the hypsies bounded into the foliage, and the stomping grew fainter, until it disappeared. They're cute when they're not trying to kill you. David turned his rifle's safety back on and stood up. The sun was almost completely down, and it was getting hard to see. His next step was to figure out where he could sleep without getting sniffed out by a predator, and he needed to find a spot fast. His backpack was filled with necessary supplies,
so he didn't have to worry about food or clean water. But he was aware that these animals had night vision, some better than others. And he knew from his son that T-Rex had the greatest sense of smell of any predator that ever walked the earth. "This is such a shit camping trip," he complained, as the chances of waking up with his entrails spilled outside of his body were nowhere near as low as he was comfortable with. The last bit of sunlight was stripped away from the world as blackness took over. Nighttime on this island was unreasonably dark. He had no idea why or how that was even possible. The full moon was out, besides the stars, and yet he could only see a few feet in front of him. Perhaps his eyes just needed to adjust to the lack of light. Regardless, he had prepared for this prior to his arrival. He reached into his pocket and took out a small pair of night vision binoculars, a trinket he had kept from his time in the military. Not exactly legal, but they weren't about to chase him now. A high-pitched sound was heard as he clicked them on, indicating they were still in working condition. And finally, the world around him was visible in turbid greens and blacks. The gift of vision was not something to be underestimated. The insect's song had taken over the birds as they had gone to rest, all but the owls, whose inquisitive hoots could be heard intermittently through the crickets. "It'd be just peachy if I could find a cave or something," he thought. He'd been camping plenty of times before with his father. Of course, having grown up in southern Texas, he didn't have much experience with jungles, particularly ones infested with dinosaurs. His mind flashed back to his encounter 2 nights ago, after he had arrived on the island with his team. The flashing lights they had seen in the trees. They had no way of knowing what they were either. They couldn't have known what was about to happen. His gaze shifted upwards, looking through his binoculars towards the branches that covered the canopy like a spiderweb, reaching and intertwining with each other. He'd be lying if he said the sight itself wasn't unnerving. But thankfully the coast was clear. It didn't seem like much was moving, save for the branches and leaves being blown about by the night winds. Soft and subtle, not indicative of any arboreal predators. For now. He separated his binoculars from his vision for a moment to rest his eyes. He found it slightly more difficult to look around, as his eyes had adjusted to the light of the binoculars. Well, it was one or the other, he supposed. When he looked through his little gadget once again, he noticed something a little strange, a few meters in front of him, on the other side of a somewhat rocky clearing. A large tree with a thick trunk, several branches shooting out of its sides. But that wasn't what caught his attention. There was something stuck to one of those branches. He tried using his binoculars, but he couldn't get quite the clearest picture from where he was standing, as whatever it was seemed to be pretty high off the ground. As he neared closer, he was taken aback by a foul odor that overtook his nostrils without warning. It took him a few seconds, but he recognized this stench. In fact, he was all too familiar with it. Death. But not just any type of death. The kind that's been festering for some time. He froze in place, his instincts screaming at him not to move forward. But he needed to know if this was danger. He needed to know if he had to run. As he neared the tree, he looked through his binoculars once again, and was met with a sight that made him nauseous for the first time in years. A human body, strung up onto the tree with branches impaling its chest cavity. Its intestines were spilled out onto the ground, a byproduct of intense thrashing. Its eyes and nose had been gouged out, presumably by smaller pterodactyls that he had seen flying around earlier, or perhaps ravens. Ravens. And that smell, that godforsaken stench that reminded him of hell. He backed away, lowering his binoculars, but the image was burned into his mind. He had seen things of this nature before, but he knew that this was different. No human had done this. The body had to be hanging at least 11 feet off the ground. A dinosaur did this? But why? And how? As he was pacing backwards, he felt a crunch beneath his foot. His attention shot down, afraid to even see what it was he had stepped on. And using his binoculars, he saw a human skull. "Oh, fuck," he exclaimed. His breathing sped up as he looked all around him. Bones, skulls, scattered all throughout the clearing, and in the trees, more bodies. Some human, some dinosaur, impaled, gutted, and drained of blood, set up like ornaments on a Christmas tree. He came to the horrifying realization that he was trespassing on someone else's territory. This is a nest.
And then, as if the forest had made that realization with him, it went quiet. A few meters behind him, he heard a faint, deep rumble, one that shook his very core. He could hear it slowly getting louder, which prompted his blood to run cold. As quietly as he could, he scanned the area around him, searching for some sort of structure that could conceal him. The rumble sounded again, much deeper and closer than before. As he crouched down and walked towards a nearby log, he noticed that there weren't any footsteps being made. Only the rustling of foliage could be heard. The log that he approached was hollowed out. Perhaps the elements were responsible. But regardless, it allowed him to crawl inside and lie down, his gun strapped onto his back along with his bag. He'd have to be insane to try and shoot this thing, whatever it was. Every creature on the island would be alerted of his presence. It would be a repeat of what happened before. And what if it didn't even work? It was too dark to make a good shot right now anyway. He would have to wait for a moment he could take to slip away. The log had several small holes, which he could peer through to the outside, giving him visibility of whoever the owner of this place was. He peered through, without his goggles at first. All he saw was a tall, dark figure with quite a bit of weight to it emerge from the tree line. He couldn't make out any details until he once again brought his binoculars to his eyes and looked at the animal. He recognized this one. He had seen it many times before. Acrocanthosaurus. Manny's favorite. The dinosaur was at least 13 feet tall and 30 feet long, covered in linear splotches that ran down the sides of its body from its spine. An intricate pattern for such a large beast. Its eyes glowed when viewed through the binoculars as the light was reflected. Its body and head were huge, built for exerting its brute force upon anyone unlucky to face off with it. This creature was not the shrink-wrapped version that some bumbling paleontologists had come up with. This animal was muscular, powerful. Even if it was just a recreation of something that once was, it once again served as a testament to their million-year-old reign of Earth. Billions of years of evolution had led to the creation of a near-perfect predator. But it smelled like crap, like what he imagined elephants must smell like. The animal bobbed its head slowly, looking from one side of the clearing to the other before approaching a tree that was yet to be occupied by a corpse. That's when David noticed that it had something in between its jaws. Another body, human, dangling from the arm. He watched as the dinosaur scanned the branches, slowly calculating which one was sturdy enough to hold his latest victim. His head jerked back slightly as he repositioned the body it held in its jaws, grabbing the corpse by its lower torso, and slowly, it pushed the body's chest against the tip of the desired branch, until a cracking sound was made and the carcass was impaled. The sound sent a shiver down David's spine. How long did it leave those bodies there? Are they really just for food? He asked himself. He zoomed in closer with his binoculars to get a closer look at who it was that the acro had strung up. It's Jermaine. He needed to hold back his gasp as he realized that it was his friend that now hung from the tree. The dinosaur must have followed the scent of death after what happened at the compound. David's stomach swirled, seeing that mammoth of a man being tossed around like a rat. He had a family. He had his own reasons to be here, just like him. And as his thoughts ran, he remembered something. The USB, he thought, coming to the realization that Jermaine was the last person holding onto the device that contained the pertinent information they had been hired to steal. There was still a chance. There was still a very big chance for him to make it out of here alive and get paid his due. He just needs to find a way to get up there and search the corpse. A huge risk. The acro might think he was a scavenger, trying to get a bite of its stash. And then, of course, there was the question of distracting the damn thing, leading us somewhere else for at least 10 minutes. That's all the time he needed to get up and search his pockets. He couldn't risk waiting for it to leave, as it might work up an appetite and eat him.
taking the device along with the body. Germain was the freshest kill after all. If anybody would be next, it would be him. And the last thing that David wanted to do was rummage through Dinosaur's shit. The dinosaur turned its attention into one of the patches of jungle, sniffing the air. Its head bobbed, questioning, thinking. It let out a series of inquisitive grunts before it quickly paced into the jungle, leaving its nest alone, unsupervised. David waited about 30 seconds to make sure the coast was clear. He didn't know exactly why it wanted to leave, but he couldn't care less. It happened at just the right time, and he couldn't waste a second of it. Swiftly, David crawled out of the log and crouch walked over to the tree that his old friend now hung from. He took in a deep breath before grabbing onto the lowest branches and hoisting himself up, carefully guiding himself using touch, softly pulling on each branch before stepping or grabbing it to make sure that it was strong enough. Eventually, he reached Germain. God, he stunk. It was almost unbearable. He cringed, placing his shirt over his nose to try and buffer the smell in some way. He sat on top of a particularly sturdy branch and looked through his goggles as he ruffled through the pockets of Germain's vest. "Come on," he muttered. He stopped for a second to listen for any possible signs of the animal returning. Complete silence. He continued to run his hand in and out of the many pockets on the corpse. He tried to avoid looking at his face. He just couldn't. He felt that he was being seen by him, even if his eye sockets were hollow and empty. Until finally, he felt a small rectangular stick inside his pant pocket. "There it is. I found it," he thought, smiling widely as he took it out and inspected. Still in good condition, no cracks, and it didn't seem wet. He let out a small chuckle, putting the USB in his own pocket and preparing to get down. As he did so, he suddenly felt a heat and humidity behind him that came in waves. It made him freeze, his eyes wide. And then, that same rumbling sound as before, but closer than ever. But how? He didn't hear its footsteps. How could it possibly have been so quiet? Shit. He turned around, being met with the face of death itself. The Acrocanthosaurus's throat slowly bobbed with every breath it took. Its head was still, eyes fixed on what it perceived to be an intruder, and its next meal. A deep, soul-shaking growl was made as David braced himself to drop down. "Now, drop now," he screamed at himself. He found his body unable to move, frozen in shock. For a moment, the dinosaur's face had the appearance of a bird. A raven. The same ravens that followed him into hell all of those years ago. The ones that waited for him and his friends to die in the desert during his deployment. He felt a sudden weakness in his legs, and his hands began to shake uncontrollably, nearly dropping the USB. Until his instincts kicked in, taking over his nerves, and finally instructing him to drop onto a lower branch as the dinosaur's jaws snapped onto the tree trunk, Germain's body being caught in the crossfire, crushed between teeth and bark. The wind was knocked out of him as his chest hit the branch, making him cough and groan in pain, but he couldn't afford to stop because of something so trivial. He could escape, as the dinosaur was now buckling from a mouthful of wood. It gave him a head start. He chuckled as his feet hit the ground, checking his pocket to make sure the device hadn't fallen out. Still there. Perfect. He sprinted across the clearing, as fast as he could, until he crashed against the trunk of an especially thick tree, causing him to recoil backwards several steps. What the hell? This one wasn't here before. Was it? He couldn't remember. However, his suspicion was confirmed when the tree began to move, followed by a low growl. Another Acrocanthosaurus shone in the light of the full moon, turning its head down to see what had crashed into its foot. Another one? The moonlight allowed him to get a better look at this one. It was somewhat smaller, with its patterns not as defined, and its color was duller. A female. The bull Acrocanthosaurus had attracted a female to its nest, and that same bull was facing him once again. It snapped its jaws in an intimidation display, creating a hollow thumping sound, accompanied by the already too familiar growls. Unfortunately, David wasn't too keen on sticking around to see if the male conquered her. He turned and resumed his sprint, making his way into the jungle, with the male accelerating as well. He had no reason to be chasing him. Why waste the energy?
David figured it must be because the animal's aggression levels were high. It had to prove himself to the female. He might not be perceived as the most successful hunter if his prey is jumping off branches and walking away. The only thing keeping David from becoming a part of the dinosaur's collection was the hazardous terrain of the jungle. Logs, rocks, large roots. It slowed down the lumbering creature significantly. Unfortunately, it slowed down David as well, and his supplies weren't exactly light. He was at a severe disadvantage. He may have to resort to his gun, and he hated the idea, but he couldn't handle it much longer. He could hardly see where he was going. For all he knew, he was running directly towards a fall to his death, and suddenly the world was awash and flushed in moonlight. He had made it out of the jungle, and was headed towards a plateau overlooking an open valley. He had no choice but to keep running, as the dinosaur burst from the tree line faster than before, no longer constricted by any kind of obstacle. It began barreling towards the human, keeping his body low to the ground. David looked back for a second, and against all of his lungs' request, pushed himself even further towards the drop as he saw the animal gaining on him. He stopped at the ledge, looking down and quickly realizing that it was possible to climb. It wasn't as steep as he initially thought. He'd have to exercise caution, however. One misstep, and he'd be dead. He hopped down as carefully as possible onto a strip of rock, beginning his descent, before he quickly felt himself slip down about 15 feet. Luckily, he was able to grasp a small ledge that stuck out of the rocky wall, overlooking a steeper part of the drop. He was now hanging by a hand. If he fell, it would prove to be fatal, as several pointed rocky formations stuck up from the ground, reaching up to him, beckoning him. And to make matters worse, he realized that the Acrocanthosaurus had not exercised the same amount of caution as he did. He looked up, being met with the faint dark silhouette of what looked like a tail jutting over the plateau, scrambling to climb back up, sending sharp pointed rocks down towards David in the process. He was about to get crushed by an 8-ton monster. He took off one strap of his backpack from one shoulder, and alternating the hand he was holding on with to remove the second strap and fling his backpack onto the ledge, taking off the bulk of the weight. Several small pebbles and slightly larger rocks rained down upon him, feeling like raindrops of steel as the dinosaur screamed shrilly, as if calling for help. With both of his hands, he concentrated his strength to hoist himself up, and use his elbows to crawl away from where he was once hanging. As he did so, he realized that the ledge was jutting out of the entrance of a cave that overlooked the valley. He smiled, but quickly had it taken away as a sharp rock hit his forehead, giving him a laceration that began bleeding almost instantly. Another, slightly larger rock slammed into his left hand, making him cringe audibly as he realized it pierced his skin as well. Blood was now gushing down the side of his head as he grabbed his backpack and looked up. The dinosaur attempted to hoist himself with his leg one last time before it lost its grip and fell. David rolled forward into the cave, crawling backwards away from the entrance, his legs burning, his vision blurry. He could hardly see outside, and only briefly was able to catch a glimpse of the animal's body as it fell. He heard a crunching sound shortly after, followed by a deep groan of pain and desperation. Somehow, that too was disturbing to listen to. He held his gun close to his chest, the sounds of his fast breathing reverberating through the walls of his little chamber. It was surprisingly spacious, but was only about 8 feet deep. I'm sorry. His voice quivered. I'm sorry. His hand shook uncontrollably as he looked down at his gun, the blood from his left hand soaking the barrel of the rifle. He found his finger instinctively on the trigger as he continued to hyperventilate. In a manic motion, he tossed his gun aside, crawling away from it as he reached into the backpack and began tending to his wounds. He knew the world around him was silent. He was aware of this, but for some reason, he heard faint gunshots that seemed to echo in the cave. He could hardly dress his injuries with gauze due to his shaking. He took deep breaths, reminding himself that he was alone. All alone. He managed to stop the bleeding from his forehead after applying some pressure, and was able to wrap a decent bandage on his left hand after disinfecting. He splayed his arms out on the ground, panting heavily, staring at the rocky ceiling above. "Thank you, Father, who art in heaven," he prayed silently. It was strangely cool inside this cave, if a little humid. It wasn't the worst place in the world to fall asleep in, and it seemed that David knew this as well, as he felt his eyelids become heavier and heavier, and his breathing stabilize, and eventually, without having realized it, David had passed out.